Hello, my friends. Today is part B in our Biblical End Time series. Today we're going to talk about national Israel and Zionism, what the real deal is, very much in contradiction to our so-called Christian Zionist friends. And we'll get to that during the course of this conversation. So don't forget, the Bible is the core of the so-called conspiracy, God's simple salvation plan, available at the top of my website, boxofsunglasses.com. Don't forget, my 3 books are also available through Amazon through links on boxofsunglasses.com. They Live, Great Society of the Undead, The Un-American Genocidal Complex, and Pleased to Meet You. So, let's get right into it. Today's national Israel and Zionism. Let's get one thing straight, okay? Everybody's throwing around this ridiculous term, anti-Semitism or anti-Semite. It's been basically equated with anything anti-Jewish. Jewish is defined nowadays, but anyway, Semitism, what it really is, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay, so the Semites are the descendants of Shem. Okay, and basically Shem was the son that occupied the Middle East. Okay, Japheth, most of Europe, Ham, Africa, and from there they went out and spread to the Far East and other regions of the world. But anyway, Shem, Semites, okay, Middle East includes people of Arab descent. So when people call you an anti-Semite, they don't know what they're saying. I know the term has become so common, but that is the real definition of what a Semite is. It includes both the Jews and the non-Jews or the Arabs. So set that record straight. So today's national Israel and Zionism. Okay, Israel as a nation was officially established by the Rockefeller-founded United Nations in May of 1948. It was officially established as a nation. Okay, but the concept of Zionism, okay, this retaking of the land of Palestine, as it was called, as it was renamed by the Romans after the Jewish revolt in AD 135. Okay, it went from Judea to Palestine because of the Philistines that were there. People more Semitic than the Jews of today. But anyway, so Zionism as a concept really came about in the 1800s. The concept of God's so-called chosen people returning to the land of Palestine and what we know today as Israel and retaking the land and retaking a lot more land as we're currently seeing today in November 2025. And it should be said, as far as genealogy, okay, a lot of the Jews that resettled in modern-day Palestine or Israel were what's known as Ashkenazi Jews. Okay, these were Jews of European descent around the area of Turkey, southwest Russia, that during the Middle Ages or thereabouts converted to Judaism. Okay, so they were not a truly Semitic people in the strictest terms of the word, as we just mentioned. So that is somewhat ironic, is that the Palestinians have more justification to call themselves Semites than the so-called Semites of Israel. So you can see how convoluted this whole thing is becoming already, and we have not even gotten to the biblical aspects of this whole scam. And of course, the national state of Israel, Israel first started resettling in the area of Palestine in 1917. Due to something called the Balfour Declaration by a British general by the name of Balfour, because the British Empire, part of it was the land of Palestine, and they promised it to the Ashkenazi Jews of Europe, and it was actually addressed to Lord Rothschild. Okay, so that's an interesting name, and we'll get more to that. And if you listen to my previous slide on the Great Society, et cetera, and the Federal Reserve System, that should be a very familiar name, and it is a very familiar name. And Rothschild had a front man called Jacob Schiff. Okay, he was responsible. He was one of Rothschild's representatives, along with Warburg, that brought us our today's scam Federal Reserve System. Okay, with of course, the all-seeing eye above the capitalist pyramid of Egypt, which we discussed in past slides or presentations, and we will discuss further in this presentation. So we have Jacob Schiff, the Federal Reserve System. Okay, not a coincidence. He established something called the Anti-Defamation League, where we get our ridiculous term anti-Semite. So to call out Rothschild as a major proponent or player in the worldwide conspiracy, which is unfolding before our eyes today, November 2025, due to the scam Federal Reserve System and other aspects. But to call out Rothschild was to say, oh, you're accusing of a Jewish conspiracy, you're an anti-Semite, so they just bury you in this ridiculous term to protect the purveyors of the conspiracy. So the ADL is a sham. And then, of course, the Schofield Bible was also funded by Jacob Skiff and Rothschild, okay, and that is the source of Christian Zionism today, okay. That's where a lot of support for national Israel comes from, is from the voting bloc of ignorant Christian Zionists, which we'll get to later in this presentation. But so it all goes back to Rothschild, okay. And no, I'm not saying that it's a Jewish conspiracy. As I've mentioned, Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan were so-called Christians, gave us so-called Christian cathedrals like St. John's of Divine Cathedral, which populates the cover of my first book, as well as the opening page of my website. So no, I'm not saying it's exclusively a, quote, Jewish conspiracy. So moving on. So Judaism today, in quotes, how do we define it? Okay, and let me just say this, okay, not all people that practice Jewish religion are in support of Zionism or the Greater Israel Project, where the concept of Israel is to take over the entire Middle East because, God promised it to them, and we'll get to that, the so-called promise, or God's chosen people. Okay, but not all Jews support this concept, so I guess we'd have to consider Jews that don't support Judaism as anti-Semites, which in turn is an inaccurate term, as we just mentioned. So again, this whole thing is just very convoluted. And the today Zionist Jews, okay, it's called Pharisaic Judaism, okay, as in Pharisees, okay, the people that executed Jesus, okay, it's sourced from the Babylonian Talmud, okay, which is not the Judaism of the Old Testament. Supposedly, God gave extra commands to Moses on Mount Sinai, which were passed down orally through the centuries prior to Christ's birth and after the destruction of the Second Temple and the Second Jewish Revolt. The Second Temple was AD 70, the Jewish Revolt in AD 30 by the Romans, as we mentioned. They decided to codify the Babylonian Talmud into writings, okay, into books, okay. One of these books is known as the Zohar, but the bottom line is, for our intents and purposes, is that the Talmud as it stands today is nothing but repackaged Babylonian paganism, worship of the heavens, etc., out of Egypt, okay. This is what God was very much against in the Old Testament, whoring after other gods, and we'll revisit that concept later on in the slide, okay. And at the base of the Babylonian Talmud is something called the Kabbalah, okay, out of which we get the so-called Star of David, which is a misnomer, which we will get to, the Sephiroth tree, or the Sephiroth tree, okay, which we'll get to upcoming here in a few minutes. And again, this concept of practicing other religions, Babylonian, ancient Egypt, was what exactly God was talking about when he said his chosen people at the time in the Old Testament was the nation of Israel. They went whoring after other gods, and you can read about this in many chapters of the Old Testament. For example, Ezekiel chapter 23, which, by the way, is mentioned prominently in my link, The Other Son of God, on my website, boxofsunglasses.com. But anyway, moving on. Okay, so let's get some quotes right from the horse's mouth, okay, the Babylonian Talmud. And these quotes, I have to give credit to a website called ZionismExposed.com, who conglomerated these quotes. But let's read through them and see what the modern day Zionists, the Jews in Israel, God's so-called chosen people, really think of Christians and these fools, the Christian Zionists. Okay, let's start at the top. Jesus was a fool who practiced Egyptian magic. Jesus was a bastard conceived when an evil spirit slept with Mary. Jesus died like a dog and is in hell buried in feces. So not much gray area there from today's so-called chosen people. Jesus' resurrection is cursed. Woe unto him who maketh himself alive by the name of God. Okay, just basically trashing the whole concept of the resurrection, which is the whole basis of modern day Christianity. A Jew must always try to deceive Christians, which very interesting verse there. Okay, that's as in modern day Israel manipulating the United States, these useful idiot Zionist Christians, AIPAC, okay, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, basically bribing the Christian Zionist voting base and the Christian Zionist members of Congress into blindly supporting Israel. Useful idiot fools like Fox News, Mike Huckabee, okay, the ambassador to Israel, etc., etc. Uh, Moving on, the one object of all the actions and prayers of the Jews should be to destroy the Christian religion. A Jew who kills a Christian commits no sin, but offers an acceptable sacrifice to God. Those who kill Christians shall have a high place in heaven. Okay, just as an aside, I mean, this language sounds very familiar. If you ever read the Quran and some of the verses in there, I mean, if you just replace, Christians with infidels, um, literally it reads just like the Quran, the so-called religion of peace. But anyway, so you can see this hatred for God's real chosen people, the followers of Jesus Christ and the true Christians. So again, to my Christian Zionist friends, open your eyes. You're being played. You're being manipulated. Stop supporting Zionist Israel. It's a sham. Moving on. So today's national Israel Zionism have something called the Noahide laws. Okay, do not deny God, no idolatry, do not murder, do not steal, do not engage in sexual immorality, do not blaspheme, do not eat of a live animal. Establish courts and legal systems to ensure obedience of these laws. Now, just an interesting one, do not blaspheme. Okay, Matthew 27. Now, when Jesus admitted and told the Pharisees when he was being tried, okay, that he was the Son of God. I mean, the Pharisees' response was, he has blasphemed. We have heard the blasphemy. So the Pharisees of Jesus' time are the same Pharisees that are bringing us today's biblical Zionism. I mean, that's just the long and the short of it right there. So the Noahide laws are against Christianity, as is the Talmud, as we just discussed. Again, illustrating the useful idiotness, if that's a word, of the so-called Christian Zionists. Education Day, March 20, 1991, signed into law by the senior George Bush, who lied to get us into the first Iraq War, etc., no new taxes, etc., etc., skull and bones member. But anyway, he signed, codified into law the Noahide laws. It's something called Education Day, March 20th, 1991. And this has been perpetuated by every president: Clinton, Bushy Jr., Georgie Jr., weapons of mass destruction, the scam known as Barack Obama, the mysterious man of mystery, Obama, okay, Trump, Mr. Christian Zionist himself, Biden, Trump again, have all reinstituted this concept of the Noahide laws as per Education Day, March 1991. So it is sort of codified into United States law, the Noahide laws, based on Old Testament or Zionism or Phariseeism, okay, the religion of the Pharisees. So, what does the Bible really have to say about God's so-called chosen people? And one of the verses, okay, many have saw the interview with Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz, the ignoramus Ted Cruz, Christian Zionist Ted Cruz, along with that Zionist Fox News hack Mark Levin, okay, referred to Genesis 12:3. He didn't know what he was talking about. Okay, so let's just read Genesis 20, chapter 12, and we'll go to start with verse 2. And I will make thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Okay, so Israel or Jacob came 100 years later. Okay, so Genesis 12:3 says to all nations, not exclusively to God's so-called chosen people, the nation of Israel. Okay, so that is just, it's just a lie to say that that was exclusively made to the Jewish people. And it's just substantiated in many verses of the New Testament, which the Jews are against, of course, per the Pharisees and Jesus, as we just mentioned. Not a coincidence. But anyway, if you go to Galatians chapter 3, the Pharisee convert, Saul of Tarsus, known as the Apostle Paul, okay, who wrote about half of the New Testament, and this is Galatians chapter 3, in the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall all nations be blessed. So then they which be of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not unto seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. Okay, so Abraham's seed is Jesus Christ, who, as we just mentioned, the Pharisaic or Zionist Jews of today's so-called Israel steadfastly reject, okay, as we just saw in previous slides. Okay, so let's just moving on to some other chapters of the Old and New Testament. Exodus 19, and he shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nations. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. Okay, now this is God speaking to Moses, okay, and he was speaking to the physical nation of Israel at the time, okay, right before Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments. But if you go to 1 Peter chapter 2, he's talking about believers in Jesus, okay, the seed of Abraham, as we just mentioned. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. So in other words, that's the exact same language of Exodus 19, referring again to the believers in Jesus Christ. Okay, and then the concept of circumcision. Okay, if you go to Romans chapter 2, now the Zionists, they love to point to these chapters in Romans as justifying national Israel. Nothing could be further from the truth, of course. Okay, so the concept of circumcision, for he is not a Jew, this is Romans chapter 2, for he is not a Jew which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart and the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men but God. So it can't be any more clear there as to what circumcision and what a Jew is. It is a believer in Jesus Christ. Okay. And then we go to Romans chapter 9. Okay, now Romans chapter 9 through 11 again is another chapter some of the Christian Zionists use to defend the concept of national Israel. Okay, so let's just read Romans chapter 9. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness has not attained the law of righteousness. Wherefore, because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law, for they stumbled at that stumbling stone. So in other words, the law, what he's referring to is the Pharisaic law or the Babylonian Talmud. So in other words, the Jews are very much into their laws and procedures as a way of being saved, which is a major contradiction to the whole concept of Jesus Christ, etc., etc. Okay, moving on to Romans 10. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believeth. So when John the Baptist called Jesus the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world, he fulfilled all the laws. It was all fulfilled in Jesus Christ. But of course, today's national Israel, along with their Christian Zionist friends in this country, are running around saying, no, national Israel, worshiping the Babylonian Talmud and the law, which is just blatantly erroneous per biblical Christianity of the New Testament. Another one that the Zionists love to cite is Romans chapter 11. Okay, let me just read this real quick. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and now standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. So what he's saying is that God rejected and we'll get to this in a second, the national Israel, okay, nation of Israel, Judah, okay, um, he rejected them. He broke them off. But what he's saying is that don't get don't be condescending. He's talking about New Testament Christians now. He said, just because I removed them, okay, or I rejected them, does not mean that you cannot be rejected also. That's what he's saying. He's not justifying in some convoluted fashion today's national Israel. That's not what this is saying, okay. And then another. Okay, so let's go to Jesus' own words. Let's go to John's Gospel. And in John chapter 8, Jesus is having an encounter with the Pharisees. And they basically tell him, well, we are Abraham's seed. We have slaves to no one. And Jesus comes back and says, I know you are of Abraham's seed, but you seek to kill me. This did not do Abraham. So basically what he's saying is, I know you are the physical descendants or one of the physical descendants of Abraham, but you're not really his descendants spiritually, which we discussed in the passage from Galatians chapter 3. And then he goes on later in the same chapter and basically calls the Pharisees the children of their father, the devil. Okay, so it's a direct accusation. There's not much gray area there. And of course, the devil being represented by the all-seeing illuminated eye, which we'll see here in this next passage from John chapter 9. So Jesus had just healed the Gentile, healed his blindness, okay, and then he went and spoke up against the Pharisees and defended Jesus. And of course, for that crime, they kicked him out of the temple. This is the Pharisees. This is the end of John chapter 9. And the Gentile that had been cured is approaching Jesus. And Jesus says to him, for judgment I am come into this world, that they which see might not see, and they that which see might be made blind. And some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words and said unto him, are we blind also? Jesus said unto them, if you were blind, you should have no sin, but now you say we see, therefore your sin remaineth. So basically what he's talking about is this whole concept of the all-seeing eye, of illumination. Okay, they think they're God. It's kind of like Gnosticism, which is embedded within the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, so Jesus says you're not God. Your eyes are not opened. You're blind. You're not the God per Genesis chapter 3. So again, there's huge implications to that verse. Then if you go to Matthew chapter 12, he calls the Pharisees a generation of vipers. Okay, so the vipers, serpents, okay, the serpent that we've been talking about. And they go on to Matthew 15, okay, and the Pharisees come up and they accuse the followers of Jesus, the apostles at the time. They do not wash their hands before they eat. They break the tradition of the elders. And Jesus tells them, you nullify God's word with your traditions. So basically what he's saying is your Talmud, your traditions is nonsense. You're nullifying the word of God. And then he goes on to say, Isaiah was right about you. You worship me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. Okay, so he's calling them hypocrites. Then you go on to Matthew 16. There's another encounter with the Pharisees and Jesus says, they ask for a sign from Jesus that he's God. And Jesus says, there's no sign given to you except that of the prophet Jonah. Okay, and then he goes on to say, you can discern the signs of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. Okay, so in other words, what Jesus was saying was, here I am, God in the flesh, right in front of your face, and you can't see it because you're so embedded within your laws and your procedures per the Babylonian Talmud that you can't see the Son of God standing right in front of your face. You're a bunch of astrologers and stargazers and things that God told the Israelites not to worship in the Old Testament, and here these guys were still doing it. Okay, and then in Matthew 23, he goes on to basically the verbal beatdown of the Pharisees, and in the middle of that tirade, he goes on, you snakes, you generation of vipers, how can you escape being condemned to hell? Okay, so not much gray area. Again, this is Jesus in his own words, which explains why today's Zionist Israel can't stand Jesus, getting right to the point. Okay, so what the Bible really says, continuing, so the Star of David, is it an accurate term? No, It is the seal of Solomon, whose son, who built the first temple in Jerusalem, which is at the core of the Freemasons. Okay, the temple at Jerusalem, they're obsessed with stone buildings, Masons, the builders. Okay, but let's just read here from 1 Kings 11:5, and we'll discover the real deal behind Solomon's seal. For it came to pass when Solomon was old that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So basically what these are these the equivalents of the Egyptian whore goddess Isis, okay, also Diana, Artemis, the Greeks and the Romans, okay, Artemis mentioned in Acts chapter 19, the female goddess, and Milcom, okay, or Molech, okay, mentioned down there in verse 7, Chemosh and Molech, okay, the male god equivalent to the Egyptian god Osiris. So in other words, all these gods of the ancient world are the same, okay, that they all point to this concept of divine male and a divine female. It's the same concept, and this is what God was so upset with ancient Israel about, because they were worshiping these gods who he specifically said, do not worship. You are my chosen people. Again, that's the concept that's illustrated here in 1 Kings 11, chapter 5. So, you may all think this is funny, haha. If you still think this is funny, haha, at this point, this name Molech here, okay, down here, or Moloch, okay, just so happens to be the name of a 40-foot owl at something called Bohemian Grove out in San Francisco that our elites, Illuminati overlords, led by Rockefeller and the rest of the gang when he was still alive anyway, but out there at Bohemian Grove. And this was documented in a film by Alex Jones, an excellent film where he went in and actually filmed this whole worship of Moloch. So our current leaders are worshiping the same Moloch of the Old Testament. So once again, you can see the concept of why I say the Bible is the core of the so-called conspiracy. Okay, so let's talk about a couple more chapters that the Christian Zionists love to refer to justify Israel as God's chosen people. Out of the Old Testament book of Ezekiel, we have chapter 37. And they all love to say, that's talking about, reconstituted Israel, Israel 1948, but it is not. It's referring to New Testament Christians who are born again, okay, symbolically coming from death into life, the life of Jesus. And we can see that in verse 24, where it says, and David, my servant, shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall walk in my judgments and observe my statutes and do them. So obviously one shepherd is referring to Jesus, who the Zionists steadfastly reject, as we've been saying, will continue to say, and the Bible can't contradict itself. So therefore, the Ezekiel chapter 37 is not talking about reconstituted Israel or the modern nation of Israel or the Zionists or anything close. Be that as it may, if we go on to Ezekiel chapter 36, I do believe that the modern nation of Israel is prophetic. Okay. And God says it twice in that chapter, I am going to reestablish you for my own purposes and to defend my own name. Okay. And then this, this gets into Matthew 24 and Zechariah, which are chapters that I believe do refer to modern Israel. I did not want to go off on that rabbit trail right now. We will revisit that in the Mystery Babylon and prophetic links. And I understand, I get it, what's the deal with Israel and Gaza and the genocide. I mean, they're not really good representatives of Old Testament, of God. Okay, I get it, but, Isaiah 55, God does things, his ways are above our ways as far as the stars are above the earth and the heavens are above the earth. So he has his own plan, his own ideas. And besides that, look at the United States. As we mentioned, the United States was established as a Christian nation based on the Bible. And what kind of representatives are we? Abortion, wars, debt, Okay, so the United States is no poster child for Christianity or God either, and we were established using Christian principles. So there you have it. Okay, so let's go through some more verses in the New Testament to illustrate the concept of God's so-called chosen people and who they really are and who they are not, as if you have not figured that out by now. But anyway, let's go look at Colossians chapter 2, and this is the Apostle Paul. And I'll just read some verses from that chapter. Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men and after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. Let no man beguile you of your reward in a voluntary humility and worshipping of angels, including those things which he hath not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshy mind. Wherefore, if ye be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why, as though living in the world, are you subject to ordinances, touch not, taste not, handle not, which are all to perish with the using after the commandments and doctrines of men. Okay, so basically, remember we talked about, back in the chapter from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 15, and Jesus tells the Pharisees, your traditions, you're worshiping traditions of men and not of God. This is saying the exact same thing. Okay, talking about the Talmud and all the rules. Okay, remember Romans chapter 10, Jesus is the end of the law. Okay, John the Baptist in John chapter 1, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. Anyway, so let's move on to Titus chapter 1. Holding fast the faithful word as he hath been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers. For there are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision, parentheses, the Pharisees, okay, essentially today's Zionists and Zionist Christians, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching tidings which they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake, okay, the money changers. This witness is true, wherefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables, i.e. the Talmud, that's my, and commandments of men that turn from the truth. They profess that they know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable and disobedient, and to every good work reprobate. So again, going back to Jesus' own words that we just discussed in Matthew 15, they're followers of the law. They're followers of traditions of men. Okay, they absolutely reject the deity of Jesus Christ in the flesh and the simplicity of God's simple salvation plan. Okay, it's just that simple. But let's go on a little bit here, getting more into the fact that the Jews, modern day Zionists, okay, are privy to God's forgiveness and salvation. Okay, but let's read Galatians chapter 3. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all in one in Christ Jesus. So in other words, Jesus is it. Okay, he represents redeemed humanity without respect of persons. Okay, so you're not above everybody else because you practice the Babylonian Talmud, because you're God's so-called chosen people. Okay, that's all Old Testament. That's all Old Covenant. Jesus is the New Covenant. Okay, it doesn't get any more simple than that. And that's basically what Paul is saying here, is that we're all equal, no matter what race or gender you are, male or female. I'm not getting into these other ridiculous genders, but that's another story. Um, God sees us all the same. Okay, First Peter chapter 1, okay, Acts chapter 10, God is not a respecter of persons. Okay, and then if we go on to Acts chapter 2, we'll see that, Peter is talking to Jews in Jerusalem, and he's saying, you killed the righteous one, you killed Jesus. But then a little bit later on, they ask, what can we do to be forgiven? This is the Jews asking Peter, and Peter says, be baptized, every one of you. And of course, 3,000 are baptized and become Christians. So even the Jews that were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus are privy to God's salvation. Okay, again, not through the Babylonian Talmud and the law, as the modern day Zionists are saying. And then, of course, we have the example of the Apostle Paul himself. Okay, he was the worst of the Pharisees. Okay, he was actually going out and physically responsible for the death of many Christian martyrs before he converted and became a Christian on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9. Okay, for example, in Acts chapter 7, I mean, he was in charge of the people that stoned to death the first Christian martyr, Stephen. Okay, so in other words, if Paul, the worst of the Pharisees, can be forgiven, then nobody's beyond God's forgiveness, but it must be through Jesus Christ and not the rules and ordinances and the nonsense of the modern day Zionist and the Babylonian Talmud. So to substantiate everything I just said, and reestablish and remake some of the points, um, let's just look at some illustrations which may help explain better some of the things I mentioned verbally. So let's start with this. Okay, here's the Balfour Declaration, British General Balfour, 1917, and it's addressed to Lord Rothschild. Okay, now Rothschild, again, he was a private citizen. Okay, a very powerful banker. This is around the time he established the quote federal quote reserve system. Okay, 1917, before the end of World War I, and the British Empire owned Palestine, and he promised it to Lord Rothschild, which just kind of indicates how powerful this family really was and still is through the scam economy. Um, but anyway, so there's that. He basically conveys Palestine to the transplanted Ashkenazi Jews, or the Zionist Jews, as I mentioned in previous slides. So there is the Balfour Declaration. And then here is a book just, talking about the Rothschilds, and just the front cover here, of course, none other than the Solomon star. Okay, Solomon's seal, not the Star of David, as we mentioned in previous slides. So it's just indicative of the Zionist beliefs of the Rothschild family. Okay, and here we have, and this book was brought up in our previous slide on the Great Society, but here it is again. Okay, and of course you can see the six-pointed star of David, so-called, really the seal of Solomon, as we mentioned, with a rising sun. Okay, the sun indicating illumination, Illuminati. Okay, in honor of the sun god Osiris of ancient Egypt, as well as the other sun gods throughout history, Baal, Molech, which we mentioned in previous slides, etc., etc., and of course the downward pointing triangle, symbolic of the divine feminine. Okay, Gaia, the earth goddess, the whore goddess Isis, etc., etc. And what's within this book is nothing but a illustration of the Sephiroth tree, or what I believe is a tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, you see a serpent climbing the Sephiroth tree. Okay, and notice the symbology here. Let's just talk about this real quick. Okay, you have three columns. Okay, divine male, divine feminine. Okay, we'll see this in future slides, and of course the middle column being three columns, the combination of the two, and of course the serpent right out of Genesis chapter 3. Can it be any more obvious? And there are 22 branches, okay, symbolic of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. So just some symbology out of the Golden Dawn, so you can see where the Star of David is really coming from, etc., etc. Okay, so let's pick this up with who I call the mouthpiece of masonry, Manly Hall. Okay, a high-level Freemason of the 20th century, quoted extensively in section 3 of my first book. But anyway, we have the sacred magic of the Kabbalah, the science of divine names, and here we see again the all-seeing eye, the triangle above the capless pyramid. Okay, not an accident. And of course, what appears on the first page is the Sephiroth tree, okay, which we just visited in the previous slide. The Sephiroth tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, in other words. So let's just read through some quick excerpts of what Mr. Hall has to say. Okay, on page 7, he talks about the religion of two general divisions. Okay, the religion of the common people and the religion of the wise and initiated. So in other words, the common people are people too stupid to realize the spark of divinity within them. Okay, they don't realize this. Okay, they're not worthy of being alive. Okay, they're worthy of being killed, literally. Okay, this is the concept of Gnosticism, okay, that, God is within us, okay, the insanity. So, of course, if God is within us, then Hitler becomes God, Mao becomes God, Stalin becomes God. In other words, they decide who lives and who dies, which they are currently doing with this insane economy we call the Federal Reserve System, okay, coming to its logical end, which is biblical collapse, okay, and of course the three world wars, which I discuss in the link on my website, boxofsunglasses.com, okay, the insanity of this drive towards World War III, which we are currently seeing, okay, it is not an accident, okay. Anyway, he talks about a divine glowing coal. Okay, again, this concept of knowledge or Gnosticism or the spark, the divine spark. Okay, mentioned by Helena Blavatsky. Okay, who we will discuss. Okay, the divine spark. Again, this process of Gnosticism or illumination, or your eyes shall be opened. You shall be as God. Okay, again, it's the same concept. He talks about the Hebrew alphabet being the fundamentals of Kabbalistic knowledge. Okay, again, this concept of 22 branches of the Sephirot tree, emblematic of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So the stuff all connects. Okay, he talks about Ein Sof, or a circular serpent. Okay, the Ein Sof is basically symbolized by a circle with a dot in the middle. Okay, which is emblematic of the Egyptian sun god Osiris. Okay, the divine male of Freemasonry, okay, the dot being the phallus of Osiris entering the female regenerative organ of Isis, the whore goddess, okay, the same concept of the divine male triangle, upward pointing, divine female, downward pointing, okay, see how this stuff all connects, the six-pointed star, etc., etc. He talks about a circular serpent, okay, and we're going to see that in the next slide. And he talks about a great white brotherhood, okay, with Christ spirit. Okay, this is the type of thing Hitler was pursuing, who he's obsessed with. Helena Blavatsky, who we'll discuss next. Okay, the great white brotherhood, a Nordic race. Okay, Hitler was literally trying to accomplish this. He was obsessed with Tibet and Far Eastern theology and Gnosticism. Okay, we're going to see this connection next. Okay, the great white brotherhood and the Christ spirit. So you can see the lies of the serpent at the core of this whole thing. Let's just read a little bit, just to kind of corroborate what I'm saying, from another high-level famous Freemason by the name of Albert Pike, again, whose letter I quote in the Three World Wars link on my website, boxofsunglasses.com. But here's what he has to say about the Kabbalah in his magnus opus, Morals and Dogma. The sages proudly wore the name of Kabbalah. The Kabbalah embodied a noble philosophy, pure, not mysterious, but symbolic. It taught the doctrine of the unity of God, the art of knowing and explaining the essence and operations of the Supreme Being. He goes on to say that Kabbalah is the key of the occult sciences, and the Gnostics were born of the Kabbalist. Okay, so again, Gnosticism, the idea that we are all God and we have this divine spark and we become God, again, where does that lead? But the insanity of the concept that if man is God and only a few recognize it, then they get to decide who lives and who dies. Hence the push for mass genocide, a 90% reduction of the world's population vis-a-vis the Georgia Guidestones brought to us by our friend Robert Christian, who I will discuss in a future link. Isn't this fun? Moving on. Okay, so moving on, here we have some more information from our Freemason friends on the left. Okay, this is out of the aforementioned Sacred Magic of the Kabbalah by Manly Hall, the circle, okay, emblematic of the cycles of life. Okay, ancient Egypt worshipped the cycles of life. Okay, we're worshiping the sun god of ancient Egypt, Osiris, and his wife, sister, the whore goddess Isis. So ancient Egypt plays prominently in the middle of this whole conspiracy. The Great Pyramid of Giza on the back of your Federal Reserve note, etc., etc. So here it is, the circle. And the reason I bring it up here is to jump over to the front cover of Helena Blavatsky's book, The Secret Doctrine. Okay, Helena Blavatsky, 33rd degree Freemason, no slouch. Okay, mother of the New Age. Okay, she's a major figure in today's history. Okay, and Adolf Hitler was obsessed with Ms. Blavatsky, as we both were obsessed with so-called Eastern religions. Okay, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., Tibet. All right, but we'll get to that in a second. But anyway, just here is the circular serpent, okay, which is basically the same symbolism with this oneness return to unity that you see on the left of your screen from Manly Hall. Okay, the serpent eating its own tail, emblematic of infinity or the endless cycles of nature, as I just mentioned. Okay, up here we have the not the Nazi swastika, but the symbol of the Buddhist sun god, okay, which Hitler borrowed from the Far Eastern religions with which he was obsessed, okay, as I mentioned, as with Helena Blavatsky, who was in pursuit, both were in pursuit of something called the Great White Brotherhood in Tibet. Of course, Adolf Hitler was trying to pursue that concept literally, okay, with his race hygiene, with help from his Federal Reserve friends here in the United States and the American Eugenics Society, as documented in my book, The Un-American Genocidal Complex. So there you have it, the Nazi swastika actually taken from Eastern religions. What is this right above the Jewish so-called Star of David, or really the Seal of Solomon, as we mentioned? So you can see what a scam this whole conspiracy really is. I mean, here you have the Jewish and the Nazi together. Okay, not an accident, all right? So again, the upside down triangle, the upside triangle, divine male, divine female. And what do we have in the middle of this whole mess but the Rosy Cross, or the Rosicrucians? Okay, another group that ties in to the whole Freemasonic Illuminati conspiracy that we're talking about, emblematic of our friend, our new friend, Robert Christian, who we'll discuss in the mysterious Robert Christian link, but who gave us things like the Georgia Guidestones and the reduction in 90% of the world's population. Okay, now remember, before Manly Hall talked about the common people, okay, those that don't get the concept of Gnosticism, that man can become God, okay, this is also reflected in what Helen Blavatsky calls the divine spark, okay, the divine spark of knowledge, that man can become God. Okay, and so again, these people literally think they're God, okay, and people that did not get this, she considered the imbecile majority. Let me put it to you this way, cut right to the chase. If you are listening to this right now, you are in the imbecile majority, and our elite satanic overlords hate you. They literally think they are God. They think we are stupid, we are non-gods, and we are worthy of death. Hence the collapse, impending incoming of the Federal Reserve System, okay, and the three world wars, okay, the phoenix rising out of the ashes, okay, out of the chaos, okay, the new golden age. These people literally think they're God. Do you see why I'm saying that the Bible is the core of the whole conspiracy when you trace this thing back? Anyway, at the bottom right here, we have the serpent climbing the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or the Sephiroth tree, which we discussed on a previous slide and we'll continue to discuss. I mean, you can almost see the serpent whispering to Eve, has God said, ye shall be as gods, your eyes shall be opened. Okay, the open eye, Illuminati. Hopefully this is starting to penetrate. Hopefully you're getting this if you're listening to this right now. So there you have it. So what do we have here? A concept just from today's Zionist. Okay, this is a book called The Return of the Kosher Pig by a rabbi. It's Zach Shapira. Okay, talking about the concept of today's national Israel or Zionists being God's chosen people. Okay, so in his book, okay, he has something called divine sparks. Okay, this is the same concept of illumination. Okay, the Great White Brotherhood. Only certain people are privy to knowing that they are God, recognizing the God within them that Manly Hall referred to in Helena Blavatsky, the divine spark. It's the same thing. It's the concept of illumination, of thinking they can see. Okay, the exact thing that Jesus spoke against in John chapter 9, which we mentioned in a previous slide. These people really think that they're God, being today's Zionist. Okay, so he's talking about sparks. And then he goes on to say, The truth by itself, represented by the lights about the nature of Messiah, will not bring him and his kingdom to us. His kingdom will be established when all of the Jewish sparks will be gathered again. So again, he's talking about national Israel. Okay, so he's somehow he's saying, well, the Jews are God's chosen people, but very simply, it's the wrong God. Okay, they reject Jesus Christ, as we've mentioned, blatantly. So what God are they referring to? There's only so many choices here. Okay, forget all the nonsense of all the ancient pagan religions. They're all referring to the same thing. They all go back to the Garden of Eden. Yea, hath God said, your eyes shall be opened and you shall become as gods. Okay, the lie told by Lucifer, the serpent climbing the Sephiroth tree, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil, going back to the Garden of Eden. Okay, this stuff all connects. It's all directly connected. Okay, so what does he go on? Later in his book, he goes on and he says, Sarah Haffernan, Metatron. Okay, what is Metatron? Who's Metatron? Okay, he's saying they're all equal. Okay, and the angel of his presidency, Yeshua. Okay, the Jewish name for Jesus, Enoch, Shaddai. He's saying they're all the same. Okay, very interesting. And let's just a couple more excerpts from the Kosher Pig. Okay, and he's talking about the Sephiroth tree. Okay, the left side of the manifestations represents the feminine attributes, while the right side represents the masculine attributes. The binod truly represents the manifestation of God through his Son. So in other words, the middle column, okay, and the Son of God to these people, let's just cut right to the chase, is Lucifer. Okay, again, going back to Genesis chapter 3. So there is today's modern day Judaism or Zionism. Okay, what's really going on here, in the words of a well-known rabbi. So let's just kind of substantiate this point. Okay, here's another book called the Josephic Messiah, Leviathan, Metatron, and the Sacred Serpent. Okay, can it be any more obvious? Okay, what's going on here? Christian Zionists, the serpent, Leviathan. Okay, what we're really talking about here. Okay, so let's just read a couple excerpts. Our exodus from the exile is therefore dependent on the study of Kabbalah, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, the Sephiroth tree. That's the base of Kabbalah, the base of Freemasonry. Okay, let's just read an excerpt. Then the hero of our story, Metatron, will make his long-awaited appearance, wrapping up the quadratic higher dimensional structure of the Josephic Messiah, the sacred serpent, Leviathan, and Metatron, with Israel in more ways than one at the center of a cosmic messianic conspiracy. This is truly the greatest story ever to be told. So in other words, modern day Israel is nothing but a bunch of devil worshippers. Let's just get right to the point. I know people are busy. I try to keep these videos short, but this is what we're driving at here, my friends. Okay. So let's move on. Here, if you just Google Metatron, okay, there's a million symbols come up. Here's one of them. He had the sun, the bursting sun in the background. Okay, the sun god Osiris, illumination. Your eyes shall be opened. Two wings. Okay, representative of also the two columns of Freemasonry, or the freeing of the mind. You are God. Forget the Jesus Christ of the Bible. We don't need that God. You are God. Okay, the insanity of Gnosticism. Okay, of course, if they are God, then they can decide who lives and who dies, which they are currently doing with this lunatic, beyond crazy push for World War III. Okay, and a sidebar. Okay, you can read about it. My 3 World Wars link in the on the link on my website, boxofsunglasses.com. But anyway, of course, within here you can see hidden beneath all the symbolism, the 6-pointed star, seal of Solomon. Okay, the Israeli flag, etc., etc. So there's Metatron. Okay, another name for Lucifer or Satan. I don't know what else to say here. Moving on. So again, here's our friend Manly Hall. Okay, the lost keys of Freemasonry. Okay, here's the later version of the front cover. Here's the front cover of the version that I have. Okay, the Freemasonry of the ancient Egyptians, Masonic orders of fraternity. Okay, the all-seeing eye above the capitalist pyramid, the eye of illumination. By the way, what did Jesus call himself? Okay, in the parable, Matthew chapter 21. Okay, um, the parable of the servants, the returning servants. Okay, he calls himself the stone the builders rejected. Okay, and also in First Peter chapter 2, the stone the builders rejected. Okay, the Freemasons, the builders. Okay, one and the same with Zionist Israel. Okay, the all-seeing eye of illumination. Here's the stone the builders. So think about that. If there's a stone the builders rejected, that means there is a stone the builders accepted. Okay, that stone is the all-seeing eye of Lucifer, going back to Genesis chapter 3. Okay, so again, we can see the concept here. Again, the Sephiroth tree, remember the male and the female columns, the two columns. Okay, the male, the active, the sun god Osiris, Luna, Isis, the whore goddess Isis on the right, the divine feminine coming together to produce Lucifer, their son, the all-seeing eye of illumination, etc., etc. The G. Okay, we saw the G. Gnosticism, great architect of the universe. We talked about this in the great presentation. Do not want to go back down there again. Okay, but again, here is the five-pointed star. This is the same pentagram out of Satanism. So again, there's other symbols in here. Just as an aside, real quickly. I mean, the sacred geometry. Okay, the number. We'll get to this in the numbers presentation in this series. Okay, so there's some symbolism here. The cross, the Rosicrucians. Robert Christian will discuss that as well later on. Again, this is rife with symbolism, etc., etc. And I'm trying to keep this thing short. And of course, here we are. We'll end up back here at my book, The Un-American Genocidal Complex. Of course, the Georgia Guidestones, which specify a reduction in the world's population of 90%, the establishment of a world courts. In other words, the B system of Revelation 13, okay, minus 90% of us useless eaters, or us stupid people out here, us commoners, okay, according to Manly Hall and the other Freemasons that do not recognize the divine spark within us. Okay, we are worthy of death because the gods of Freemasonry and modern Zionism and our Illuminati overlords, our fellows, our overlords have deemed it so. So they hate us, okay, with a hatred that is only ascribable to the father of lies himself. They have deemed themselves God. They want to overtake the world, and they want to get rid of us little people, okay. So this is where this drive, this insane drive for world war, okay, for economic collapse, the purposely designed system of failure known as the Federal Reserve System, okay, it is not an accident. So again, you're starting to see why I say the Bible is the core of the so-called conspiracy. Okay, hopefully you're starting to see that here. So you got the Georgia Guidestones brought to us by our friend Robert Christian. Again, the Rosy Cross, the Rosicrucians, okay, intertwined with the Freemasons, and I don't want to go down that rabbit trail. We would discuss that at length in the mysterious Robert Christian presentation. And of course, we have the American Illuminati, known as Skull and Bones, okay, 322. Okay, remember, I mentioned this before, the three columns of Freemasonry, okay, along with the 22 letters, the Hebrew alphabet. Can you see the symbolism here? The Brotherhood of Death, the American Illuminati, okay, Skull and Bones, etc., etc. Okay, and of course the United Nations building, established, bringing back the world government in the physical, okay, and then just moving on here again, you can see once again the columns of Freemasonry, the 1, 2, 3 columns, okay, G, Gnosticism, the pentagram, the divine male, the divine female, just to reiterate the point. There's coffin, the concept of being born again, okay, into their god, Lucifer. Okay, we discussed this in the great length, but again, that's the anti-concept of being born again. That is that right there. So in conclusion, to wrap this up, kept it under an hour. I know people are busy, but here is the the so-called Star of David, the Seal of Solomon, the national flag of today's Zionist Israel. And here's one of the leaders of the Christian Zionist movement, a friend of Mark Levin, the Zionist hack on Fox News, okay, John Hagee, in defense of Israel, okay, with this ridiculous Seal of Solomon, which we've mentioned, which is established is really in honor of their god Lucifer. Okay, so the so-called Christian pastor John Hagee, along with these other useful idiot Zionist Christians, don't know what the hell they're talking about, pun intended. Okay, so do not go down the primrose path of worshiping national Israel. Okay, it is the wrong path, as I've mentioned. I don't know what else to say here. Okay, and again, I'm not saying that they're all condemned to hell. They're all privy to God's simple salvation plan, as I mentioned before in Acts chapter 2. But it's just, it's unbelievable to me. It's, again, They Live, okay, John Carpenter's movie They Live, a satanic conspiracy of blindness being carried out by the so-called establishment. Okay, just another lie. Okay, I talked about this in the Great Link, how everything is a lie. Okay, so we have another big lie of Christian Zionism, of so-called Christians supporting Zionist Israel. I don't know what else to say. So again, the Bible is the core of the conspiracy. God's simple salvation plan. Boxofsunglasses.com. If you get nothing else out of this presentation, this is it right here. God's simple salvation plan. Boxofsunglasses.com. Good day and God bless.